Hi, this is Andy. A while back, I was sitting through a discussion that was talking about having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. I'm guessing many of you have heard those before too, right? I mean, it was an interesting discussion, but I couldn't help but think, I just don't think it's that simple. I think it's like a lot of things in life. It's not if I have a growth mindset, it's when I do or when I don't, and when that works for me and when it works against me. It's so much about the context. And I'm not down talking growth mindset at all. It's a really powerful idea, but there's got to be more to it than just a mindset. There has to be action or habits to back it up because ultimately performance matters, not just the mindset. And by the way, I know all this because I just finished reading a book that takes these ideas and runs with it. Eduardo Briceño joins us in this episode to talk about his new book, The Performance Paradox, turning the power of mindset into action. It's a practical, evidence-based guide for how to balance performance, which is critical, with learning. In today's discussion, you'll learn what the performance paradox is and why it's so important. Eduardo will explain the difference between the performance zone and the learning zone and how to know which one you're operating in at any one moment. And we'll talk about some misconceptions people have about growth mindset and learning. And you'll even get some ideas on how to help people you lead understand these concepts. It's a fun discussion. I can't wait to share it with you. Before we start, if you've been listening for a while, you've heard me mention our No Freaking Idea course that rolled out earlier this year. The feedback's been so encouraging. If you know someone in college or recently graduated or even further in their career, but they're struggling with career uncertainty, this course is for them. And as we expected, many of the people purchasing the course are giving it as a gift to someone that they care for as a way to invest in them. So whether it's you that's wondering about next steps in your career or a son or daughter or relative that you'd like to invest in, learn more at nofreakingidea.peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Eduardo about his new book, The Performance Paradox. Eduardo, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andy. It's great to be here.
Hey, we'll get into ideas from your book in just a bit, but I'd love to ask you this. You mentioned your mother and father in the dedication of the book. Can you think of any ways that your family culture shaped your thinking about learning and performing, whether positively or negatively or both?
Absolutely. They are both super, super caring, and they made my sister and me their highest priority. But if anything, the culture in my home and in my school and in more broadly got me into what I call chronic performance. My dad worked for the same company for over 30 years, an oil company. He was a mechanical engineer. He started in the oil fields, and I grew up in Venezuela, and he ended up being the CEO of one of the divisions, and he just worked really hard throughout his career.
Yeah.
So his career is kind of something you don't necessarily like, but you just go and you work hard and you do what you're supposed to. And that's what I ended up doing in school. And then at work. So at school, I wasn't particularly interested in anything. But not having a particular interest, I just did what I thought I was supposed to do, which is work hard to get good grades. So I was just focused on the performance, right? And I would just get whatever I needed to do in the test, forget everything, go to the next thing. And that's how I got to university. Then I ended up looking for a job that was just high paying because I wasn't particularly interested in anything, and just performing what other people expected, what society expected of me, and that later got me into trouble. But so I think society, including my home culture, got me mostly into trouble.
Yeah, and I think that's the story of a lot of people, right? I think there's some generational aspect. I looked at my dad, and he worked hard. He's a bricklayer, and he would work all day, and then he'd go do what he called scab jobs at night. That was his way of saying side job. That was his side hustle before people talked about side hustle, and just more bricklaying. And he would say it wasn't because he loved the work as much as I'm providing for my family. I think that's what he would say. But we were modeled that. And I feel like from an early age, we're put in these situations, just like you talked about, where we need to perform. Whether it's school, like you talk about in the book, it's almost like we're not taught to learn. We're taught to get the grades, right? We're taught to perform. Sports, what's the score? What are your stats? And eventually on the job, like you talked about. And one of the big lessons I took away from your book is that performing is important. But at some point, a chronic focus on performance doesn't lead to better performance. In fact, it might actually hurt it, which I thought was interesting. So how do you explain this performance paradox?
Sure. So the first thing is the first insight that I had when learning and working with Carol Dweck and Lisa Blackwell and other people is I learned the difference between learning and performing. And I realized that that difference is something that some academics are clear on, some coaches and great athletes are clear on, not all of them, but most people are not, and I wasn't. I didn't know the difference between learning and performing. So a great way to understand this is to look at people who are fantastic performers and very skilled people in domains where performance can be objectively measured, where you can see that somebody's very, very skilled, like a world-class athlete, for example. When we see them doing what they do, like we see them, for example, playing a championship final, what we see is what I call the performance zone, which is when they're working, doing what they know best, trying to minimize mistakes. And what we don't have clear is that we tend to think that the reason they become so good at what they do, is that they spend tons of hours doing what we're seeing. So if you want to become a world-class tennis player, you just spend 10,000 hours playing tennis, and then you'll be a world-class tennis player. And if you look at the research, that's not how it is. And if you study how these people become so good, they become so good because they spend a lot of time doing something very different from what we see. When they are in a match and they're having trouble with a move, for example, they might avoid that move during that match. But then after the match, they'll go to their coach and say, "Coach, I have to work on this particular move." So that's a very different activity, an area of attention and focus than what we see when they're performing. But we don't see like behind the curtains. We don't see how they improve. We don't see their process. Mm-hmm. And what often happens in work and life for most of us, I know it did for me, is that we are only focused on getting things done as best as we know how, trying to minimize mistakes. So we're in our performance zone all the time. And that hinders our performance. And that's the performance paradox, is that if we only focus on performing, our performance suffers. And something that's a little tricky about it is that that's actually not true when we're novices. Like when if I don't know tennis at all and I just go into the court and start playing, I will get better just from trying to play, with friends. But then once I become proficient, I'll stagnate. And then I'll say, "Oh, I'm spending a lot of time playing tennis. I'm not getting better. So I can't get better." That's a fixed mindset. When the reality is that we actually are not clear on how to continue to get better.
It's so interesting, because if you'd have asked me before reading the book, I would have said to be a great chess player, you just play lots of chess, right? And you talk about that in the book. Same thing with tennis. And you give the example of speaking. And so it's something you and I both do a lot. And you can see sometimes when people are kind of in the rut, right? They've told that story too many times. It's not even funny to them anymore. And it's interesting that performance zone, as you call it, almost, it doesn't have to, but it can create this complacency where we, like you said, it's almost, well, I guess we hit the lid, there's nothing to go from there. So I think
absolutely. Yeah. As opposed to the learning zone, which is when we leap beyond the known, when we try something new, when we try something that may or may not work, or we solicit feedback to the people who are in the room that we're speaking with, or we observe other speakers to see what they do. So that's different than just kind of going and doing what we do.
Yeah. If you're willing to answer this, like, can you think of examples in your recent life where you were in one and also when you were in another, like just example for helping people understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just finished writing this book. So for this, it was a huge challenge for me, way outside of my comfort zone, way outside of what I had already done. And so a lot of my life, and I think a lot of what our life can be, is performing and learning at the same time, where we are trying to do something that's challenging beyond what we know how to do. And that's going to involve like paying attention to what might work or what might not work, asking more questions to people who have done that before so, for example, I spoke with lots of other authors, right? And I asked them questions for their advice. That's an example of a learning zone where I asked somebody else for advice. Or in the drafts of the writing that I was doing, I would show them to readers or to editors and get their feedback. So that is a learning zone strategy where I am learning how the text might be better. We might kind of restructure things and say, hey, what if we change this story and cut it in the middle and put this other thing in the middle of the story, see if that worked. We're trying something that might or might not work. And that's an example of a learning zone. And we're doing it with the purpose of increasing performance, right? Of creating a great piece of work. So those are examples. Now I'm a public speaker. So when I am speaking, like when I'm serving a client or serving people who are there, I am mostly in my performance zone. I want to, they're busy people. They are hiring me because I'm an expert in what I do. And I want to make sure that it's going to be a great experience for them. That said, I always tweak something. And I, even though like I'm doing something that overall I'm doing a lot of things that I know work well, I'll try something like little that I think will work great for them, kind of to customize, say, for these group of people, maybe this thing that I've never done before, maybe that will be great. And I'll, as a way to test it without, if it doesn't go well, it'll still be go well overall.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate in both your TED Talk and in your book, you talk about Beyonce. When you think, all right, there's a all-star performer, has learned everything she would need. But after she goes back to the hotel, it's not to the spa, right? It's to, it's almost like watch the game films in many ways, right? And not just herself, but her dancers, her backup band, their camera people, right? Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And she makes notes. And so watching the video, like you're saying, and she shares those notes with her team. And the next day they meet and they talk about what they're going to do differently the next performance. And that's how they continue to get better.
Yeah. It's actually inspiring. I thought an interesting question you had in that section was, you can tell if you're in kind of chronic performance, I think you said it is, if you kind of reflect on yourself of what ability or quality am I working currently on, or ask a trusted colleague, which I thought was a really clever addition to it. What ability or quality do you think I'm working on? And so I just thought I'd ask you this, if it's a fair question. What's an ability or quality that you're currently working on to develop?
Yeah. So one specific one is kind of checking email, like in as an overall, like doing more deep work, which is particularly challenging right now because I'm like doing a book launch right now, right? So I have a ton of messages from readers and from podcasts and other people, and is my inclination would be to get excited about that, like see the reviews on Amazon, and so a challenging thing that I'm working on is turn all that stuff off, and spend like 2 hours working on something. And that's what I'm focused on right now to improve. But overall, in addition to that, the project that I'm working on of doing, for example, lots of podcast conversations like this one, I haven't done a PR campaign before. So that forces me to get into both learning and performing. And so before we started this conversation, I asked you, what are some things that your guests sometimes do or don't do that work well or not for you? That's a way for me to combine doing something that's going to add value to you and to your listeners while also learning myself, what works and what doesn't work. And so I can do a better job.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that because I've heard, I would say more authors than not say something similar to they're like, I love my research. I don't even mind the writing part, even though it's really, really hard. It's this part that is so difficult, but you can look at it of, I'm a victim or I've got agency, right? And I can learn and this, it fuels you. For me, I feel like, what's that again?
Go ahead. No, you ahead.
Well, I just feel like if I ask you the question, I should maybe answer too. Like there's a form of meditation I've been trying to learn a little bit about. So it's not very long, but I'm about a month or so into it. And I feel like I'm learning. I feel like I'm a slow reader, Eduardo. So I've been really working on how can I read the book more quickly, but retain the essence. And so I read your book in 2 hours. And I feel like I got the book. I feel like I enjoyed the book. I wasn't like, I forget that. So I'm really, really working on that. And then basketball coaching, I'm coaching some youth basketball. Your book actually made me think about that we call it practice, but is it really practice? Like you talked about, sometimes we use that term practice, but are we actually learning or not? So those are just some examples. Does that kind of fit within what you're thinking of as the learning zone, I suppose, or
Absolutely.
at least the goals?
Yeah, absolutely. I find meditation to be an interesting example because I've also, I like to meditate, and meditation is interesting because it like most things that you want to improve at, you can put effort at improvement, but in meditation, like you can put too much effort into it, and so
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of having a great guide is a strategy that might help me with meditation. But it's an interesting kind of tension between kind of working hard at getting better, except that's not exactly
Right.
how it is. And to your point about practice, yeah, sometimes we might think like, how many years has this doctor been practicing, right? Or this
Right.
lawyer been practicing? And that we mean like, how many years have they been performing, right? So
Right.
like sometimes we're not clear on what actually is practice to improve versus performance.
Yeah, no, it's really got me thinking in that way. I'm guessing everyone listening to us has heard of the 10,000 hour rule, and though we know about it, I think it's often misunderstood. So what did Erickson actually, or what's the misconception and what did Erickson actually find?
Yeah. So the misconception is that to get great at something, you just need to spend 10,000 hours doing that thing, right? And so, for example, we might think that to become great musicians, the Beatles spent 10,000 hours playing in bars, right? And so Anders Ericsson, who was the expert on deliberate practice, he said, no, actually, like, playing in bars is a performance zone activity, and that's not how you get better. And so if you want to get better at the guitar, and I used to play the guitar growing up, and I was horrible. I didn't understand practice. I didn't understand the difference between deliberate practice and performing. So when I would quote practice guitar, I would just play the songs that I enjoyed playing, that I was good at playing. It would make me feel good, and I would sing, and it would have fun. But I was horrible. I was pretty mediocre. I wasn't getting better. And I've learned since that, to become a better guitar player, you need to do deliberate practice, which means you isolate a very specific skill that you want to work on. And you work on that very specific thing. You hear how it sounds. You might start like slowly, for example, you hear how it sounds. Based on that feedback, you adjust your movements and you iterate. And between each iteration, you make some changes based on the feedback. In this case, is how it's sounding. Ideally, you do that with a coach or a teacher so they can guide you along the way, versus, playing a song. And so with the Beatles, what Erickson said is that he thought that what makes the Beatles great is not their technical ability to play instruments, but is how beautiful the songs are. And if you wanted to actually see what made the Beatles great, he thinks that you would need to study how they compose songs, not how they played songs. That was his perspective.
Hey, just to be fair, in your TED talk, when you made the move like you're playing the guitar, you look like you knew what you're doing. Okay, I just want to be clear. You look like you knew what you're doing. So you might have been a little more of a rock star than what you're willing to admit. But I thought that was funny. Yeah,
I guess I could fake it, which is what the other thing that I was doing early in my career is that I was trying to prove myself rather than improve myself, right? Instead of being honest with myself and others about when I was unsure or what questions I had or different thoughts I had that were contradictory, I would just kind of pick a side and try to make the best arguments for that side. And, if I was unsure, if I receive feedback, I would react defensively. And I guess like pretending like I know how to play the guitar might be an example of that.
Actually, I appreciate how you told that story early in the book about sitting in these investment meetings and I don't know. How am I supposed to know? It's almost like that insurance person. Like, I don't know how to sell insurance. At some point you have to dig in, but a lot of times we don't. We just fake it. It's just part of the performance zone. So I think people will relate to that story a lot. I think another example of something that we've heard is the growth mindset. I mentioned that in the intro, and you've worked extensively with Carol Dweck, who to me is like the face of growth mindset. And yet there's a lot of platitudes about growth mindset and learning for that matter, that kind of abound. So what are some of the most common platitudes that maybe not necessarily drive you crazy, but you feel like it doesn't quite capture what it is?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, it's exciting how much people have gotten excited about growth mindset and how much they embrace it and it resonates. But when I speak with groups that want to deepen their understanding of growth mindset, even if kind of a lot of people have read the book and done work on it, I start by asking them to write down in my own words, what does growth mindset mean? And so if the listeners have an idea of growth mindset, I encourage you to think about, what does it mean to you? And what people often answer is it means being open-minded, or it means working hard, or it means persevering.
Or
And
positive thinking. Do you get that sometimes?
Positive thinking for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like having high expectations, believing you can do it. Those are all examples, and they're not growth mindset. Growth mindset is a perspective about the nature of human beings. Specifically, is the belief that we can change, that our abilities or our qualities are malleable, that we can develop them. And the reason that's important is that what growth mindset research has shown is that in order to take on the learning zone, like learning behaviors, we need to believe that we can change, right? If we believe that intelligence, for example, is something that's fixed in people, some people are smart and others aren't, and that can't change, then you're not going to do anything to try to become smarter, right? Or if you believe that musical ability is something that's fixed in people, you're not going to do anything to become, better at music, or, introversion, extroversion, or whatever, leadership, anything, right? And so that's one. Growth mindset gets usually distorted into other things that are related to it, into usually the behaviors, like the behaviors that you want to see. And one problem with that is that if I'm a leader, for example, and I'm not seeing that some of my colleagues are persevering, and I just say growth mindset is perseverance, we need to persevere. We might encourage them to persevere, but what the research shows is that if they believe they can't change, then that's going to get in the way of perseverance. So our telling them you need to persevere is not really addressing one of the root causes, which is the belief. So we have to work at the belief level and at the behavior level in parallel. And sometimes we forget to work to shift our beliefs about the nature of human beings and our abilities.
Yeah. In the intro, I talked about it seems to me it's more contextual. You're not one or the other. Do you have any comments on that one? Because you know what I'm saying? Like sometimes I feel like, okay, the growth people over here, the fixed people over here. It's not that simple, right?
Absolutely. I totally agree with your remarks there at the beginning. It's not, sometimes people say, I'm a growth mindset person. And it's not like that. We all are in a fixed mindset some of the time, just like you said, and about different abilities and sometimes about different people. And it's not even like a growth mindset is always good and a fixed mindset is always bad. Just like you said, sometimes a fixed mindset is useful too. I'll give you an example. I believe that I can't get much better or even a little better at like reading a book while I listen to an audiobook. Like I would like you, I tend to read slowly,
Right,
and I would like to be able to read more. And one, if I believe that I could read and listen at the same time to different things, I might try. I actually tried to do that as a kid and I completely failed. But actually a lot of people do something like that. Like if, a lot of people join meetings while they're reading their email or reading social media. That's the same thing, right? They're reading something while listening to something else. I believe that I can't learn how to do that or get better at it or get good at it. And that's a fixed mindset. I think it serves me well because I believe there's scientific research that backs it up. I could be wrong. The thing with a fixed mindset is that we can never be 100% sure. There's a possibility that I'm wrong. But I believe, based on the research, this is the belief that I have. And then if I want to get more effective at learning or at reading, for example, I'm going to try different strategies. I'm not going to try that strategy. I'm going to try a different strategy to improve in learning or in reading. And so that's one thing. It's like regarding different abilities, we have more of a fixed mindset or growth mindset. Also, it's not binary. There's a spectrum. We might be somewhere in the middle on some abilities. We also might think of ourselves in one way and of somebody else in a different way. Like I might see myself as a learner, but label somebody else in a fixed way. And so I think that, especially for people who kind of see themselves as fully growth mindset, I encourage us to reflect and try to uncover more of our fixed mindsets. Because that's, often we think, oh yeah, well, this thing is fixed, but it's just not an ability. It's just something that's always fixed. Like height, height is something that I see in a fixed mindset. And so, but uncovering more of that increases self-awareness. And then we can start questioning, okay, is that assumption true? Or is it something that I've assumed that might not be true?
Yeah. I've never heard anybody say that fixed mindset can be good, but I think you're exactly right. That makes sense. And whether it's actually true or not, it could just be instructive in that I've got a fixed mindset about being a mechanic on a car. Like and all that means is I don't really have a whole lot of interest in learning more. Could I? Yep. And if I followed your book and I really want to, I could turn that into a growth mindset, but I've just got kind of a fixed one of like, I kind of know what I know, and that's going to be pretty much it. I mean, that's kind of along the lines of what you're saying, I think, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a nuance there, which is that if you believe, I heard you say that you believe you could learn it and you could improve in that if you engage in the learning zone in effective strategies. So I would say that's a growth mindset. A growth mindset is the belief that we can improve. It doesn't mean that we have to take action to improve, and that wouldn't be effective. Like we wouldn't want to try to improve at everything. We want to be strategic. We want to think about what are my most important goals? What are the most important things for me to work on? And that way I can make more progress toward whatever I deem most important. So if you believe that you can't become a better mechanic, that's a fixed mindset. If you believe that you could become a better mechanic, but you choose not to, that would be a growth mindset.
Okay, that's good. As I'm learning, that's good. Let's say someone listening to us, they want to get better at managing their time. So it's not exactly what you said before, but it's along those lines. And it just feels to me that's a pretty big bucket. So if I understand your ideas correctly, maybe they'd want to chunk that down into something smaller. Okay. So they can get a little bit more deliberate. So we're speculating here, but how might you coach them through this, including maybe some learning zone strategies? What comes to mind?
Yeah, so I think identifying the goal is really important. I want to become better at managing my time. That's progress. And then I might do some research there, or either reflection to think about, okay, how am I going to go about this? I might come up with some ideas that feel like good ideas to me, but I might not. And then I might ask I might do an internet search and say, what are some strategies to better manage my time? And so I could read or watch videos or listen to podcast episodes on people who are experts on time management and how to get better at it. And I could learn from them some strategies. And then once I have here's some possible ways to get better at this, then I can choose, say, one and say, here's one thing that I'm going to try and work on and be deliberate about that. Just focus on trying that out to see if you make progress. And then regularly reflecting on how well that's going. Am I making progress? Is this strategy working for me? Do I want to keep using this strategy to continue to improve? Do I want to try a different strategy as well or change strategies? But the strategies are really important. It's like how is it that I'm going to try to get better at this thing? And if we don't have a good idea of that, then just doing some research or getting a peer so that we can kind of support each other and brainstorm together and keep each other accountable along the way.
I was rather inspired by your growth propeller idea, because right in the middle of that is identity. And I think sometimes people, let's say time management, they may just say, well, Eduardo, here's the problem. I'm just not an organized guy. Or I've got a friend, she's Cuban, and she goes, I'm Cuban, so I never pay attention to time. I'm always late, right? That's an identity thing. And so I wonder if part of that, if I'm interested in your take on this, but part of it might say, I'm going to start, even though I can't remember exactly how you say it in the book, but identity is not necessarily something you discover as much as something you create, I think is how you said it. And so I might say, I am going to be a good time management person, or and I guess it's another way of saying the growth mindset, but any thoughts of how identity could play into that particular scenario?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's the quote that I have at the bottom of my emails by Thomas Sanz, and he said, the self is not something one finds, it's something one creates.
Yeah.
And I just really resonate with that, because to your point, if you say, I'm just Venezuelan, I'm just always late, and it's just limiting, right? It limits your options. So you can choose that identity and just to always be late, but that's going to limit kind of your growth and your development in that. And so there, at the same time, we need some stability. So we need flexibility in our identity, and we also need some stability, because we need the sense tomorrow that we are the same person that we are today, and we need to balance those two things. And I think what's most important to me when it comes to identity is just to see ourselves as a learner, as someone who is always continuing to evolve, which means that we always need to continue to change. Sometimes we like the idea of improvement and development, but we don't like the idea of change very much. And we can't improve without changing. If we're the same, we haven't gotten better. And so thinking of ourselves as change as the default, how am I changing myself proactively every day, rather than also reactively when I have to.
Yeah. I've been about a year and a half into it now of trying to change my diet pretty substantially because of some blood tests. It wasn't terrible, but just enough to kind of wake me up. Yeah. And so I try to tell myself, well, what would a healthy person do here? So not saying whether I was or not, but it's almost like using identity as a way to frame a choice. And I think that's along the lines of the propeller, right? Because you had things like the beliefs and that kind of and habits. And I thought community, if I remember right, that was the third one there, that was part of it. So being surrounded by people who are trying to do that same thing.
Yeah, our community just shifts. It impacts our beliefs, like growth mindset, impacts our habits. And yeah, I grew up in Venezuela and I ate very few vegetables. I ate mostly just meat and rice. And so for me, I've also become mostly kind of whole food, plant-based. And that has definitely involved a shift in my identity and what it means to eat in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much in the book, and we focus most of our time here on just, trying to understand and navigate these as individuals. But you have a whole section in the book about how do you help your teams get into these zones. So can you think of just a couple of your top examples of someone listening to us that I want to get this idea across to my team? I feel like we're too much in performance zone. And of course, get them a copy of the book, right? Can we just agree that would be a really good idea, Eduardo? But in addition to that, if they wanted to kind of help nudge people into both zones instead of just the performance zones, what's an example of a thing or two?
Well, first, to tie to what you were just talking about, the growth propeller, which the growth propeller is the last chapter of the part one of the book, which is about for individuals. So the blade that you mentioned called community, is important to mention that because sometimes we think of growth mindset as something that lives in the individual's mind and it's just a function of what you believe. But our beliefs are so affected by the people around us and what they believe and how they communicate and how we collaborate together. And so it's really important to build communities, whether it's our teams or our families or, our friendships, where people are interested in growth and people are interested in learning together and collaborating both in the learning zone and the performance zone. So to your question about if I want to kind of start a conversation with if I want to inspire my team to explore this idea of the learning zone more, I would encourage people to introduce these ideas and start a conversation, right? And so, like, for example, even if you have like formal leadership role, rather than like say, okay, from now on, we're going to be doing this, instead share some content, some resources with your teammates and have a conversation about, hey, how did this land? What do people think about this? So I have an 11-minute TED talk on the learning zone, the performance zone. It's called How Do You Get Better at the Things You Care About? And so something that teams sometimes do is they watch that, whether together or separate, and then they come together and they think, okay, what do we think about the learning zone and the performance zone? Do we want more learning zone in our team? And just have a conversation about that. How are we doing? Are we already doing great on this? Can we get better? And if we do want to get better, where do we start? What is one thing that we can work on together to get better at this? Like, are we going to work on soliciting feedback, for example? Or are we going to create a section of our weekly meeting where we're going to share what we've learned recently, or where we are going to ask each other questions or like share insights that we've learned from customers? So that if we change the agenda, we change the conversation in the meeting, so that it's not just about getting things done, about performance, but also about learning. So I think I would say introducing the ideas and starting the conversation, and then people tend to gravitate. People tend to love this, and so they want it, But it's great when they choose it rather than when it's imposed on them.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. And I never would have thought of the idea of a shared watching of the TED Talk, because the TED Talk does a really good job of introducing the ideas. And I love the visual of the safe kind of a safe area in the shark infested waters. Like, how can we as a team make it this is a safe thing? Or like, you talk about radical transparency in the book. I think maybe on that one is it's one thing to say it, but am I modeling it? It seems like with the team, that would be a big thing of, am I modeling, hey, here's what I'm trying to work on. And the fact is, I interrupt you a lot. And, or I might be tempted to discount what people bring, if it's a risk. So I'm going to work at listening to the risks and not shooting those down to create more psychological safety, but they're being more transparent, right? That's something they could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So to your point about psychological safety, people often feel like if they make a mistake at any time, other people will think less of them. And so
Right.
we're trying to minimize mistakes all the time. The only way to do that is to be in the performance zone all the time, because in the learning zone, you're leaping to the unknown. And so you can't expect it to do all perfectly. So if people feel like when they're not flawless, other people will lose respect, then they're always going to be in chronic performance. And so
Yeah.
how do we create that safety that you're saying? For us, three things that we can think about is one, how we frame things or how we set the stage. So how do we talk about things like growth mindset and learning zone and performance zone? And to your point, what are the times and spaces where we want to focus on performance? That's also important. Performance is how we get things done, is how we contribute. And sometimes the stakes are high. We don't want to take risks at certain times. And so getting clear on when are those times. And so setting the stage. Second is systems and habits for performance. That's usually often there, but what are their systems and habits for learning? So thinking about both of those and setting those in place. And to your point, number three is about modeling learning, because sometimes, especially as leaders, when we get promoted, we get the sense that now we need to know the answers. We need to be sure of ourselves.
Right.
And so we might even do a lot of learning in private, when other people aren't watching, but then we present ourselves as knowers. And then when people just observe us as knowers, that's what they emulate. And then we create a know-it-all culture.
Yeah. Just reminds me of how much more I'd love to talk to you about, but let's end it with this question. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast, and can you think of anything that parents could do to help their kids apply some of the ideas in this book?
Yeah. So first, one thing that parents can do is think about how you feel about failure and mistakes and challenge taking. Sometimes parents want their kids to get straight A's or win every game. And they're uncomfortable if the kids struggle, if the kid is taking on something that's really hard that they're not doing at 100% or being the best. And when parents have that relationship with failure, they see failure as debilitating. The kids tend to foster more of a fixed mindset and then play it safe. So they tend to stay within their comfort zone. They don't take courses on areas that they haven't done before. And as a result, they later, tend to struggle more and to be more kind of staying within their comfort zone rather than thriving in new ways and expanding their horizons. Also, like when we speak with kids, just focusing on their behavior and helping them reflect and sharing our learning process along the way, rather than kind of be careful about labeling them, right? Labeling them as smart or labeling them as naturally talented. There's research that shows that when we do that, kids foster a fixed mindset. They get the sense that the reason people succeed or do things well is because they are naturally talented or naturally intelligent. And again, that leads them to stay within their comfort zone, not take risks. When they don't do something perfectly, then they tend to lie more to themselves and to others. It creates a bunch of problems. So I guess, encouraging challenge seeking, curiosity, asking questions, experimenting, and modeling the way again. So like when we're coming home, are we talking about what we're learning, what we're struggling with, what we're going to try differently, soliciting feedback? Are we doing that as parents in front of our families?
One last thing that comes to mind regarding that is, the story you had about Gino and Julia, and I don't think it was about them. I think it was another family that just looked like the perfect family. I don't know, maybe they were the perfect family, but I think it was another one, just like a perfect family. And what they kind of worked through was there is no such thing as the perfect family. And I wonder if sometimes as a kid, they might think that person, they're just all good, the perfect Instagram pictures, the perfect grades, the, no zits, like everything's perfect. And the fact is there is that some of this is a facade. So just understanding that, it's not just those performance things, like you said, it is, hey, let's learn more. We might learn that that there's opportunities to serve them. There might be opportunities. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Actually, the whole Gino story throughout the book was pretty interesting, I thought. But
and I think social media exacerbates that, right? Because people tend to present kind of when there's joy and things are going well, and I think that ties to what you said earlier about transparency. When we develop relationships with people where we share more of each other, then we can learn how everybody struggles and in different ways, and we are seeing not only what people are portraying themselves externally, but we're also seeing their process, their thinking, what they're grappling with. And so having more honest and open conversations with each other.
Yeah. Well, for those listening, this is just a taste and even barely a taste of the ideas shared in the book. If you resonate with this discussion, get a copy of Eduardo's book, The Performance Paradox. I put links to the book's website, and Eduardo's TED Talk in the show notes for this cast. So, Eduardo, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
It's great to speak with you, Andy. Thank you for having me.